and we're in it. Buddy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm feeling great. So I can't wait to have this conversation, Alice.
Tell me about this AI. You came in just a couple minutes ago talking about this AI phone call and how like most of the people we're interacting with are not real anymore. I want to get right into this. So what happened? Like someone called you and you picked up the phone and what was it, like for a service or something?
I can't remember specifically what it was about, but because people get spam calls all the time, but this one stood out in particular because of just the natural intonations of the voice. It was like the uncanny valley where you can just tell something's not right. This isn't truly how a person speaks, but if you were distracted, if you had a busy day, if you were expecting a call from someone else, it could have easily tricked pretty much anyone, I guess. And that's when I was starting to really not fear AI. I think it's something that we're going to have to grow and live with just because it's inevitable at this point. But it definitely made me feel pretty uneasy, especially for a lot of the older population or just people who aren't as familiar with technology in general. No one's expecting to hear a call that sounds like a human that's a robot, that distinctly sounds like a human. And then when you go into, I guess, family members and people that we can make them start sounding like that. That's really scary. And I actually heard someone when I was shooting a documentary in Hacienda. I was interviewing like the local Chinese population about how Chinese New Year is celebrated in LA and in America in general. There was some apprehension with some of the interviews just because someone told me, someone that I was interviewing was warned, what if they take your voice and then make it sound like you and then call a family member and try to solicit money out of them? And I was just like, because I was shooting a documentary, I was just like, that is just the most, I thought it was ridiculous. I was just like, that's not what's happening here. We're just trying to get your story. But at the same time, it's completely valid fear to have in this day and age, especially if you don't know how all these things work, and especially if you do know how all these things work. That's scary.
That can be creepy for sure. Yeah, I've heard stories of like people using other people's voices to like pretend that they're their kids and they're like in Bali and it's like, oh, I need $2,000 or $5,000, like big emergency, and then send it to this account, and then it's not even your own kid or something like that.
No. And how are you? And if it sounds like an emergency situation, people, they lose that sense of rationality and they just go into, okay, what do I need to do to make sure my family's safe? So the scam industry, I know it's big in Southeast Asia right now. I've watched some docs about how they have mass farms in like the Golden Triangle area, Thailand, Myanmar, kind of things where these Chinese gangster business people are setting up entire factory farms and then getting people to go there under the pretense of a work-away program. And if you look those things up, you can realize how vulnerable people in the West are to those, because everyone in this generation is dreaming of, oh, I can just work somewhere else for a couple of months and it'll be a great experience. But there is some legitimate fears. Not that that should dissuade anyone.
There's a new movie out with Jason Statham called Beekeeper. But it's about this, like it's about one of these call centers and they scam old people out of their money. Yeah, like they get into their computers and then they get them to go onto their banking platforms and stuff like that. And then like 5 minutes later, all their money's gone. And then, but he
Stops.
he stops it. Yeah.
He's a top.
So something has to happen if Jason Statham's going to get angry.
I just watched the Crank movie from like early 2000s.
Oh yeah.
Recommended me that one. That's a hilarious, Jason.
Those stand up. Those are crazy action movies.
I love the rough and raw aspects of it. That's definitely a good watch.
So man, let's get into this. So look, you're a young filmmaker. You definitely want to be storytelling. You've talked to me about some shorts and some docs that you want to get working on, and we'll kind of get all into that shortly. But I think it's super cool that you also grew up in Shanghai, China.
Yep. Shanghai is definitely where I consider my home to be.
That's wild.
Yeah, that's not gonna leave me. It's just the place I grew up. It's the place where I learned how to speak English. Really, it's where I learned how to speak Chinese. It's where I rode my bike. It's where I had my first kiss. All these things that make a home a home. That's just Shanghai to me. So sometimes people are just like, well, why is that? And it's just like, that's where I learned how to be who I am. So
I think I had very fond memories of China until COVID. I think I might have I think like I definitely have some PTSD around like just how fucked up everything got there for a little while.
Yeah, luckily I left in 2019. So the last time I was in China before November of 2023, it was 2019 in December. So literally just weeks before COVID was a thing.
Yeah.
And my parents were there during the 2020 Shanghai lockdown, and they had some fun stories about that. One of them, which is an anecdote to kind of describe that whole situation for people who are unaware, was they were doing food rationing systems at the time, and so the government would send different animal parts to communities. And the way Shanghai works is most of it is in these kind of gated areas, apartment complexes. So they would send the food rations to the gate, and then they would be distributed however that local system distributes them. So they sent like pigs to our kind of complex. So some houses got the head of it, some houses got the hooves, some, you got to use all parts of the pig. So it was a very much ration system.
The scary thing about that is that those gated compounds were actually locked and bolted, and the people who lived in them could not leave. That's the terrifying bit.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the
that and how they just started rounding up like cats. That kind of like anyone who wants to start rounding up pets is going to have a serious problem with me at some stage.
That's true. And I think that reaction towards that kind of global situation in China kind of revealed to a lot of people in the global, in the international community, and also just places outside of China, how China operates. It's very different to how people assume it kind of operates. I think there's a kind of interpretation, at least I hear from my friends, of like China is a very much authoritarian system, which it is.
Yeah.
Which it absolutely is. But that, consistently kind of dictates how everything in that country works. And just because from the top-down government authoritarianism doesn't really translate all that well into some local areas. For example, I would say the way that policing was held, specifically during the COVID lockdowns, you could tell that it was very much, there was a dictation from the top, but then in the reality, it was kind of people just figuring it out in the moment and doing what they thought was best because that's what their superiors thought. So it wasn't a lot of concerns with the day-to-day stuff. It was, we need to get this done by any means, and that's where a lot of the very, very hard stories come through. It's because someone was told to do this, they have to do it by any means, so they're going to find a way. So the government says you can't let people out. Some places might have said, okay, here's our policy, here's our conversation. There are stories of that in China. Others places where here are nails in the door, we have a camera in front of your door, you can't leave. So
yeah, it's insane, isn't it?
Yeah, it gets very sad sometimes.
I don't think I could ever be a police officer or work in the military because I just don't take orders well. Like I just feel like I would be like, well, let's have a chat about it. Like this can't be the best.
Yeah, there's got to be a middle ground.
Yeah,
but,
that just like blind acceptance of other people's directives, I think, is something that I definitely struggle with.
Yeah, I'd say that it's I have similar kind of things. I'm very much desiring what people consider freedom. I feel like freedom has like a different connotation in every single area of the world. To Americans, freedom means something very, very specific, but to people in Europe, freedom, I think, means something else. And you don't want.
You want to hear something fucked up? I just had a speaking engagement get canceled at a university because of the Israeli-Palestinian protests and the encampments and all that shit. Yeah, because they didn't want to have anyone come on. I'm not a very controversial person by any means. I just talk about climbing mountains and stuff. But but all like kind of unnecessary events have been canceled for the foreseeable future. And I was like, that really pissed me off.
Do you think that's because they're worried of what people might say given like the current political system and they might deviate from like their thing? Or do you think it's just like a just in case?
I just think they just didn't want to have any kind of, they just want to kind of take away any potential flashpoints. I don't think it had anything to do with like where the conflict is in the Middle East and the fact that I've never even filmed in Israel or anything like that. It has nothing really, I think, to do with me. I think they're just shutting down the university, just classes only, I think.
but I don't want to get into the politics of how that works out.
But yeah, anyways, I'm pissed off. But anyways, I really wanted to. Yeah, I love chatting with students. I mean, you're fresh out of school.
Yeah, it's weird when freedom of speech is restricted in times when it's needed the most, and it gets very dicey.
Well, the right to protest is being honored, and the protesters are getting their right to protest, and the protesters are getting their right to have free speech. But then I lose my speaking event.
A shame.
Yeah, it's not so good. So look, let's go back. Like, where are you from originally?
Okay, so I was born in Boston, then my family moved to New Jersey, and then when I was about 3 to 4 years old, we moved to Shanghai. So I have no memories of Boston. I have memories of kickball and preschool, I guess, or preschool in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And then the rest is just Shanghai until I moved to Santa Clara, California.
So your parents just fucking up and moved you to China at the age of like 3, 4. How ballsy is that?
Nah, I have a lot of respect. At the time, of course, I remember asking the question, "What's China?" when I was like 3 years old, just because I didn't really understand what was going on. But yeah, I have a lot of respect for people, especially now that I've moved back and I understand a lot better how hard it is to move to different areas of the world. Coming to America was a little difficult for me as well.
Yeah.
But I have a lot of respect for people who are able to just up and move into a lot of uncomfortable circumstances. And this was 2005. So this isn't the China that we're familiar with today. This was 2005 China. So
that was my favorite China.
It was fun. It was fun. It was a lot different. But it was a really good time. It was a really good area to grow up, and I have to say that there was a lot of things that I was exposed to there, people I had got to meet, and just the mindset of an international community that brought a lot of the best qualities out.
It's so cool that we were in Shanghai at the same time, but we never met.
Yeah.
I did my 18 years.
Yeah. Then I did my 15. So
yeah.
That's long enough, let's be honest. A good 18, good 15, anything over 10, honestly. You'll get the full experience.
I was just having drinks last night with one of my friends, and we actually met each other in Shanghai in like 2004 or 5 or something like that. And then, yeah, he just lives a few blocks away. Yeah, and he's moving to Portugal with his wife. You know, they want to have like one last big adventure before like they slow down or whatever. So I think he's in his late 50s, and they're just moving to fucking Portugal, and he's like, I'm gonna fucking live in Lisbon, like why not, right? So he's emptying out his house. He brought over a ton of stuff, gave me all these cups and stuff like this, and books, and yeah, and then we had a bunch of whiskeys, and then yeah, he's heading out soon. So, but yeah, he's a Shanghai friend, and then he came back to LA.
Well, best of luck to him. I've heard Portugal right now is a great place for digital nomads. They had a whole system of encouraging people there through different economic incentives. So there's a huge international community that I heard was blossoming over there.
Yeah, the digital nomad visa is something that like really needs to catch on in a much bigger way, because like if you're making enough money to sustain yourself, like you're not going to be a drag on any of these countries' economies. Like they should just let you fucking go where you want to go.
It's true. Some countries are definitely acknowledging that and respecting it. There are certain limitations that happen on the other end that people, I think, aren't talking about enough. You know, the dangers of tourism and stuff like that. But at the same time, there's totally a way to do this that benefits both parties. It's just when there's too much, where there's a lack of restriction and money talks is where the problems kind of arise, and like the different cultural communities that are hosting all these foreigners start to get eroded. And Shanghai actually had a good way of dealing with it, I should say. And I'll say that very cautiously. But the pandemic really changed the way that foreigners were seen in China.
Yeah.
And that kind of mindset.
I don't know, all of my friends that I grew up with in China, like grew up with as an adult, like everyone's left. Yeah.
There's a lot of Russians and Ukrainians there right now that when I went in November, I noticed that the foreign populations, they're mostly centered around like Jing'an right now. I think that's like one of the hubs right now, which it always was, but now it's.
Yeah, I lived right there. I lived at Urumqi, Zhonglu, and Changlilu, right in there. And of course, that's French concession. It was where everything was kind of happening.
A lot of good restaurants, a lot of good nightlife. Yeah. There's still a lot of those restaurants there, but What I notice is that there's a certain, it's still Shanghai. Everything that's there is still there. There's just the foreign community, at least in my experience, brought a lot of life to the city, for foreigners, of course. And that's kind of been replaced by a more push towards local drives, which honestly, for China in general, that's a good thing. You want the local population to feel more empowered in their own cities and their own spaces. But at the same time, that does come with a lot of economic drawbacks, which they're facing right now. Because on one hand, their policy is China first, and they're pushing all these policies and attitudes to ensure that that's a thing. On the other hand, they're still looking for foreign investment while they're actively trying to push it out, and that doesn't work. And they're finding that out the hard way.
It's strange, isn't it?
It really is. To say one thing and need another, and everything's behind closed doors. I mean, you know how China works, so it's just...
That's how this country works. I mean, the politics is just garbage everywhere.
Yeah, that's what I tell. Yeah, that's what I told to a lot of when I first moved to the U.S. in 2019. I noticed that the way that politics are conducted between here and China, very, very similar. The way they're talked about, completely different. But the actual bare bones of what's going on is pretty much the same thing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's wild. So what did your parents do that they had to move to China when you were like 4?
Yeah, so my dad was an investment banker. So my uncle was in China actually before us. He had some sort of business going on. So then my dad was also there. The initial plan was to stay there for about a year. My dad was always on business trips back and forth, so I didn't get to see him much when I was like 3 or 4. So my family just thought might as well bring the whole family over, stay for about a year and leave. That's a popular model that a bunch of my friends kind of did, where they stay for 3-4 years, 2-3 years, and then go back to their own countries. Yeah. But we just enjoyed the lifestyle so much that we just stayed. So yeah. And then my mom started the business there around 2011, and after the financial crisis, we just decided that despite everything, this is a good place to raise some kids. And I never really wanted to leave. And I had one brief stint where I thought about going to the last 2 years of high school in America, but looking back, I think I made best decision to stay there and really finish out the whole process.
It's amazing that that you kind of like grew up in Shanghai. I mean, like there's just so few people who get that kind of international experience at such a young age.
Yeah, and I'm a lot more appreciative of it now that I've left. When I was there, I couldn't understand the significance of it because that's all I knew. But I understand the opportunities that it gives me now because I have friends from every different country now. So once I have the resources to start traveling on my own, I really, one, want to catch up with them, but two, I understand how I can, just be ingratiated into their cultures because I grew up with them, and I have a lot to look forward to for the rest of my life because of that. Also, just the mindset that it gives you. I mean, there's plenty of problems with international schools, but I truly believe that it was, for me, the best way that I could have grown up. So I think about it a lot. I'm very grateful.
Did you ever take trips in China, like during your holidays and stuff like that?
Yeah. I've been a lot of places around China just because one, we wanted to see it in its totality. Now, China's just such a big country that you could stay there for 1,000 years and never really scratch the surface of everything that's going on there. Shanghai, particularly, is a relatively new city, considering that some cities there are 5,000 years old and Shanghai's around a couple hundred, really. So it is very different from the rest of China, but I've been... Xi'an was a great one. I remember I went there when I was just like 12. The south of China, very, very hot and humid, but Dongguan kind of area, Guangzhou. Beijing is not my favorite because of how cold and polluted it was, especially back when I was a teenager in a middle school area. We used to go there for school trips sometimes or sports tournaments, and I remember that it was interesting. Wow.
Beijing's a bit rough, but man, walking on the Great Wall is kind of nice though.
True. We camped at the base of it, so we walked along it and then set up tents, and it was freezing, but it's beautiful, Yeah. It just is.
I remember when I first went, it was 2001, and I remember kind of working my way up the East Coast, just going city to city. It was absolutely lovely, and then I just remembered being in Beijing, and then I went out to Xi'an. And then I started heading west. And then when I got to like Gansu and I started getting out into the desert and Xinjiang and stuff like that, my eyes just opened up wide. And I was just like, oh my God, how are we still in the same country? Like I fell in love I fell in love with the diversity of China and having all this access to all these different places. And then I started working for the New York Times and stuff like that. And then I think I've been detained or arrested in every province in China working with the New York Times for sure.
That tracks.
Yeah. It was a rough one. The worst one by far was probably Dongguan in Guangdong province. Yeah.
Because that area is a little more seedy, so I think the cops are a little.
It was strange. Like we were in a factory, and the factory owner just fucking detained us for like 12 hours. It was kind of crazy. It was and then the police were there, and the police didn't know what to do, like, because they're like, well, the factory owner should be in charge, right? The police. Yeah, it was pretty funny. It was David Barbosa and I, because he was writing a story about Thomas and Train, the Thomas and Train. They were, I don't know, a bunch of kids were like eating the trains, and they had like lead paint on them, and they were getting sick.
Melamine, that kind of fiasco that was happening in the early 2000s with the plastic in the milk, that kind of. Or
no, that was different. Yeah, it's every good couple months there was a good China scandal.
I was always joking about that during the pandemic. The worldwide one is that China's been through plenty of epidemics when we were there. So when this one came through, I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, we know the plan, and then the rest of the world didn't, I guess. But China did, the first couple of years they did pretty well.
One of my first stories for the New York Times, I think it was like 2005. They had the avian flu, right? So every couple of years there's avian flu. But China came out and said, like, we're gonna give vaccines to every single bird in China. And then we were sitting in the New York Times office in Shanghai, being like, that's not gonna happen. So we went out. So Howard French and I, we went out to Anhui province, which is the hub of the poultry industry in China. And we sat in some small village next to the veterinary clinic, and we waited for two vets to get on a motorcycle and ride out to some poultry farm. And we asked the poultry farmer if we could, watch and take some pictures and stuff like that. He said, fine. And the vets guys didn't mind either. And we were just there and being like, yeah, so this is part of the national program. And they're like, yep. So that day we were there, they inoculated like, I don't know, maybe like 1,000 chickens or something, right? One needle.
Yeah, that's the problem with policy when it's dictated. You got to get it done. Doesn't mean you have to get it done right. Yeah, that's China in the nutshell.
That's the scary thing. Yeah, but that was a front page story, actually. That was fucking hilarious.
Yeah, that is. I remember when avian flu was going around. My parents kept saying, "Don't touch birds if you see them." Never, because it was a big thing. And there used to be this dude with a chicken right outside our school that whenever I'd walk from like the bus or whatever, and I'd always be wary of the chicken. That stuck with me for years. I was just like, I really want to pet it, but
the chicken man.
Yeah, he always just had a chicken running loose or in a cage.
What was it like? Kind of like being a teenager as a student in China? Because for two things, I think growing up as an expat, you kind of grow up a little bit privileged, perhaps, and that can be different. And I think also too, as long as you're not breaking any laws, the police go pretty light on expats in Shanghai. You can get away with quite a lot. But what was it like growing up in that kind of environment? Because it's a really safe city. Like there's almost no crime. There's no guns, right? I mean, like versus living in LA. Holy shit.
Yeah, people don't really talk about how dangerous LA is, when they're talking about America in general. And Shanghai, I'm pretty confident to say it was the safest city in the world. Like from the time we were young, like maybe 12, 13, we pretty much had access to the whole city. There's trains everywhere. There's taxis. We could just go anywhere. There was never a fear of honestly anything happened. I never grew up with the fear of, oh, this could be bad. It was just like, no, we'll be fine. If we went to we went out on a night and then we were too intoxicated, we'd pass out in the back of the cab. There was never a fear that I wouldn't wake up right in front of where I need to be. And then the taxi driver would just wake us up. We'd be like, oh, thank you. And growing up with that kind of mindset, I think I had like a very picturesque idea of the world. I think certain parts of Asia in general, because of just the cultural, what's the word for that? Just the cultural environment there, it's very much help everyone kind of thing. Everyone wants to make sure that everyone's safe. This isn't everywhere, of course, but I'd say in a general level, most Asian cities are a lot safer than cities in the West.
It's just the guns, really.
It's the gun. Oh, knives too. I was never scared of any of that stuff. It was never a consideration. People used to get in fights all the time. There was I remember there was one story when I was about 16. I heard from a friend where they got in a fight with the wrong people at a bar one time, and then they had to go out like the back entrance because apparently there were some Russians who had been known to have weapons or something like that.
Those Russians.
Yeah, that was the one time I've ever heard of anyone, and it was fun. We went back the next week. There was never like we gotta stay away or we gotta be careful. Shanghai's definitely the safest city in the world. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was when I was there. So
it was pretty good. I never had any real problems. It was nice.
I used to sleep on park benches, just take a nap in the middle of the night. I need to rest up for an hour. Never a fear of being robbed. Never a fear. No, it just didn't exist. Now, as a foreigner, I do have to acknowledge that, the way that the foreign population, especially from 2005 to before COVID, was treated in China is a lot different from the, local population. There's definitely that caveat. So a lot of the experiences, the way I talk about China is definitely through the lens of a foreigner who was living there. So that is something I got to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think life for Chinese people inside China is much harder than what we went through.
Definitely. And a lot different too. And then the way that history has kind of dictated how foreign populations operate in Asia factors into that every day. And it also factors into how the future is going to continue, because a lot of this foreign influence through money or just power, or the idea of the East trying to become more like the West in order to compete, has allowed for foreigners to kind of operate without a lot of consequences, I would say. And that started to change a lot in China once the cameras started ramping up. I remember there's a famous story of these 3 foreigners, I think they were American Canadians, who got off on the Gaojia, the highway near Nampu Bridge, took a piss on what's it called, in the middle of the highway, and they were heavily persecuted. And China made Shanghai government made like a big statement to say, hey, you guys can't do this. But I also know that when I was living there and operating there was lawless for us teenagers, so we could do whatever.
Did you ever have a driver's license?
No, but I did drive there.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to learn, and I don't think I'd ever been pulled over in China. I don't remember anyone ever getting pulled over in China. So
I rode a motorcycle all the way around China and set a Guinness World Record doing it. And I just remember how hard it was for me to get a Chinese driver's license. And I remember how difficult it was for me to get a Chinese motorcycle license as well. Because I lived in China, so I knew how to ride a motorcycle around China. Like I'd been to pretty much all the places that I was going to take this motorcycle. So, but I didn't know like what kind of paperwork do I need? Like, how do I do you even get insurance like for a motorcycle? Yeah, and it was a big 800cc bike. Like it was a serious bike. And I just remember like trying to put all this stuff together and just how incredibly difficult it was. But I did get a driver's license, yeah, and I still have it. It's good till 2025, I think. Yeah,
pretty good. I was about to say there's no hell like Chinese bureaucracy. Dealing with that, oh my, yeah, that's tough. But I remember a lot of people in high school always had like electric mopeds, and until they started policing that a lot heavier around like 2018, 2019, no one had a license. We would all just drive them around and kind of operate. So I think there was a period of kind of just not amnesty, but lawlessness around bikes that the government around 2018 tried to fix. But before then, yeah, for small motorcycles, bicycles, people would drive those often.
Yeah, those little electric scooters and stuff like that. And my buddies all had them. They were great, yeah.
Yeah, they were very convenient.
Yeah.
I don't think any of my friends had licenses, looking back.
Or wearing helmets.
No, of course not.
That's wild, man. I think it's pretty special. Like I always tell people like my favorite time to be in China was definitely the build up to the Beijing Olympics. So I got there in 2001. So from 2001 to 2008, I felt like that was the most exciting time to be in China because so much was happening. But also too, the pollution was terrible back in the day. And then 2008 was great, Beijing Olympics. Then 2010 was the Shanghai Expo. That was pretty intense.
Seeded the clouds, clear skies in the middle of April or whatever it was. I couldn't believe it. It's clear blue skies repeatedly for weeks on end.
Yeah.
Never happened before.
Yeah. Now they took that technology to Dubai, and now they're fucking causing a bunch of storms and stuff like this.
See, gotta know the consequences of what you're dealing with.
Don't play God. Let nature run its own course.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of if I saw any environmental consequences of that when I was there. I remember it rained a lot, but Shanghai's used to rain, so
Shanghai's a rainy city for sure, yeah.
So 2-3 weeks maybe where it just rained every day right before the clear skies because they seeded. They had the infrastructure to deal with it at least.
Did you live in Pudong or Puxi? Yeah. I went to school out there and everything.
Yep. Same school the whole time. Great experience, honestly. Didn't appreciate it enough when I was there, but it's funny because whenever the older kids would graduate, sometimes they would come back from college overseas, and they'd always tell us, "I don't know how good you have it." And we're just like, we were so excited to just leave our area. Everyone's excited to kind of grow up and just see different things. And looking back, I understand completely what they meant of, there's a lot to appreciate there, but growing up in it, you just can't see how much you're going to miss it later on, I think. Just the freedom. And people don't often associate China with freedom, but in my personal experience as a foreigner there from those time periods,
it was free, and the form of the economy back in the day, it was the most ruthless capitalism I've ever seen in a communist country, like especially Shanghai. Like the stuff you could do business-wise, like in those early 2000s, was insane.
It really was. I have stories.
Yeah.
That looking back, that should not have been allowed. But Western influence in Asia has a long history of breaking rules when necessary. Yeah, and the Chinese learned from that, actually, and that's why I think there's a lot of fear towards China and America right now, is specifically because, from what I can tell, they're incorporating all the things that we've done in Asia for the last 300-400 years, and then pretty much just doing it back to us. Great example is how the British kind of used the opium trade to cripple the economy and the people and control it. Kind of what the Chinese are doing, selling fentanyl to South America and making its way in the U.S., and they're just kind of dominating that trade. It's not a new program. We did it to them for hundreds of years. They're going to do it to us because they know the game plan. So
I always say that China is killing the Americans right now with killing their brains with two things. One is the fentanyl trade. So fentanyl is obviously a chemical drug, and it's being produced. The root chemical is being produced in China, and then they ship it over to Central America, and then they turn it into like what we know as fentanyl, and then they ship it up. And there's a crazy documentary on Netflix. I can't remember what it's called, but it's all about the fentanyl crisis in Vancouver, because Vancouver has a real drug problem. Like they've always had a big heroin issue and stuff like that. And this it's only like a 45-minute or 60-minute doc, but it's awful. Just talks about all the fentanyl. And then the second thing that their Chinese are destroying all our minds with is TikTok.
Of course. We can get on both of those things, but with the fentanyl thing, first of all, I think people need to understand that it's still this is the problem with the free market system. Not that I'm complaining about capitalism, but the problem with the free market system is that China is going to sell it to whoever has money. They're not looking for government. So we have all these powerful American pharmaceutical companies buying it from China, contributing to the problem. And then the cartels down south, they have billions of dollars. They're just, China's not going to vet them. Why would they turn down their money? So that's kind of exasperating the whole system, as a lack of regulation. But with TikTok, I love this conversation just because of, I'm not even going to credit it to the Chinese government's forward thinking. I'm going to credit it to serendipity and our response to like the Arab Springs crisis. Since I was in China before Google got banned and after Google got banned, I would say that I have to be very careful with how I describe this, but I would say that if you were going to build a country, if anyone was going to build a country with a shit ton of people, the best way to ensure stability is through control, obviously. Now, America sustains the status quo via a lot of grandfathered in systems that they ensure through lobbying and a lot of money that will never change. While social policies might change, the core systems that run this country are never going to change. Hopefully not, but that's how they maintain the status quo. China, as a recently developing country, they only had a real economic revolution in like the 80s and 90s, so they are very much still an emerging market, or they were in the early 2000s. So when they saw the Arab Spring crisis happen, where all these Arab nations were having mass revolts based on Facebook and social media, they understood, oh shit, this thing is gonna be the thing to take us down, and they found a way to ban it, create the Great Firewall, and essentially control. They can't control everything on social media, but they can still put in the barriers to make sure that it can't really turn into a real protest. And this is before all this is 2010, 2011. This is before TikTok and content creation and this explosive burst in social media. So they found, and the reason why I say it's serendipity is because I don't think they could predict that far. I think they were just making sure that wouldn't be a revolt through the internet essentially back then. And how this translated into the current way is that they control what people see and what they consume every day. Chinese TikTok or Douyin is the most consumed thing probably on the planet, honestly. And the fact that they understood back then and then implemented the policies to make sure that they had almost complete control of what people see, they can ensure that their population is being fed what they want to feed it. And that is pretty significant when you're running in a billion-person nation and making sure that all these factors can't really arrive into social unrest, which the only time that was really tested on like the large scale stage was with like the A4 protest back in or the blank white paper protest back in 2022 or 2023. I think it started with the Xinjiang population. There was a fire in like the Xinjiang area, which is controversial right now, just the way that China's handling that whole situation.
Sure.
And the Chinese population all rose to protest how it was being handled, which a mass protest in China hasn't happened since, I want to say, 89.
There's been pockets of protests. I mean, especially like, and the COVID. I mean, people were protesting for COVID, and then like a week later, they just opened up everything.
It was a concession that hadn't happened before. Really. It's kind of amazing. And the thing about the A4 or the blank paper protest is that what I find so significant and so cool about it is that it's called blank paper because they couldn't write anything to actually protest, but the entire population knows what they want to say, so there's no need to write it. And that as a way to just voice concerns about a government is very, very, I guess, interesting to me.
Yeah, I remember a few times in Shanghai, they would allow like anti-Japanese protests in the street, but those kind of sometimes got out of hand too, but they were just trying to like let off some steam. And yeah, it's a strange place. I liked living in Shanghai, but I loved having access to like the more remote areas because I was always traveling with my buddy. I had a great friend. He's still alive. Still my friend Brandon. Fantastic writer. We used to go on trips out to like Sichuan and Yunnan, go hiking up in the mountains for like. And that's actually what started me thinking about making a TV show about that kind of stuff. Yeah. It was the first. So we would do these stories for like that's Shanghai and that's Beijing, and like they would give us like I don't know a couple $100 or whatever, or grand, and we would go out and we would go to like these remote villages in Yunnan province with no roads that you had to like hike 3 days to get to, and we would stay with the people and he would write and I would photograph, and when we would put together like these beautiful travel stories. I remember we went to this little village called Baihanlo, which is in the Nujiang Valley in Yunnan on the border with Myanmar, and it was so far up the valley, and it was like we had to walk a day after the road and the whole thing, and it was amazing. They had this like it was a Tibetan culture. They were pretty much Tibetan. They were right on the border with Yunnan and the actual province of Tibet, but they had a Catholic church in the village, and French Catholic missionaries in like the 1800s made it up to this really remote village and built a church and converted them all to Catholicism, and they still practice Catholicism. And then we actually got to witness a mass while we were there. So it's so strange because, like the British, the way that they kind of used religion to tame the populations, it was very, very different. But the French missionaries, they got all into these crazy mountain villages, all in Yunnan and Sichuan, and you'll find all these like little pockets of strange Catholicism everywhere. It was beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. China is just such a diverse and beautiful place. And people talk about the cities and AI and the chips and everything, but that country is so huge. There's so many different pockets of just beauty that so much you can learn from. That's a very, very cool story. I mean, religion in China is a very interesting topic in general.
Yeah.
I think it was banned outright until recently. I remember I grew up Catholic, so I remember when the year that we moved there, that was like the first year that our church was allowed to be a church.
As long as the priest is a member of the Communist Party and he can be controlled at any time.
See, it's all these things. It's all these things that you realize after the fact.
Well, we did a story with the New York Times about like underground churches. Yeah, and like how people wanted to like find a religion. I mean, I'm not a very religious person, and I don't, but you know, everyone needs whatever they need. So, but they were doing these underground Catholic churches in Shanghai, and we went to one of the meetings and stuff like that, and they just wanted to have like they wanted like a safe place to like, I don't know, pray, like talk about their religion and stuff like that without having any like mention of the Communist Party. It was really strange. This was like maybe 2006 or 7. Yeah, because then they started banning all these underground churches and putting people in jail, and that was part of the story too. Yeah.
I can imagine, yeah. I remember there was no mention of the party in our churches. However, I remember that our priest definitely had to essentially read from a pre-prepared script that he prepared, but who knows who had to approve that. I remember there were always something. I mean, thing about China that people need to realize is this whole, the government dictates things, and this is how things actually are. So the government might say, this is how religion is going to work in our country, but if you go to a village in the middle of nowhere, who's enforcing it?
It's funny, you know, I talk to so many people who say they know a lot about China, and they talk about how like powerful the central government is, right? And it's the total opposite. I actually find China to be very similar to the United States, where the federal government says whatever they need to say, and then the states either agree or disagree, or they don't give a fuck. And I tell you, like the provinces of China and the leaders of those provinces, they do whatever the hell they want. They don't listen to Beijing at all.
Exactly. Yeah. People, there's always a mentality that, oh, she says something and it's law. And that is a factor in a lot of, you know, public areas, you know, and in presentations. And that I can see how the media, especially Chinese media, which is creating these stories, kind of make that a thing. But if you really look at it, there's too many people to really just police like that constantly. Now, with cameras, that's slowly changing, and China has a lot of cameras. I remember I've been in 4 years until I went back in November, and oh my God, there were way more than I remember.
Really? Just everyone's watching all the time?
I mean, there were always cameras. There was CCTV was a huge thing on the cameras and everything, but it was surprising to me. Even I'd been there the whole time. I saw the cameras go up. I saw the buildings go up, and it was they've changed, and they're a lot bigger to house like the components to make sure that they can do facial recognition stuff. So what's funny is that they really have made it very obvious. They're not hiding them anywhere. You'll see one pole and 11 cameras pointing in different directions in People's Square, you know, on that metro system. So
I wonder, like you and I would look at all those cameras and we would say like, wow, our privacy is really being fucked over. But I wonder what the local Chinese people are thinking. Do they see all that and be like, oh, that's going to keep me safe?
That's a really good question.
Or do they also, you know, because Chinese people, like, because I had a lot of Chinese friends, you know, and their idea of privacy and their idea of personal safety and stuff like that were totally different than some of the things that, you know, I had grown up with, you know, going to universities in the West in North America.
It is very, very different, I would say. And I can't speak for the local population, but I can speak towards the attitude that I noticed when I was there. And I can see there was a big shift in the attitude from when I was there 15 years ago versus when I was there a couple months ago. And that, I think, is due to the amount of young people who have now grown up and have their own opinions about this. When I was there, when about 13, 14, I found that the Chinese population is a very apolitical population. There's only one political party. So they're very apolitical about certain things, and they don't like voicing things publicly. There's plenty of reasons for that. Cultural Revolution, just the entire Maoist ideology and how that kind of carried on through Deng Xiaoping's legacy and things like that. But I would say that for me, because when I grew up in China, I had Chinese phones, you know, all these things. There was always an understanding that, yeah, the government can look at everything that you can do and everything that you see and the keystroke things and everything you type into WeChat, and you have to be careful. But at the same time, and they're very vocal about that, but at the same time, when Edward Snowden kind of released all these things about the US, I was just like, isn't this the NSA is also looking at everything we did? So I would say that the policing and the cybersecurity is very similar, but the attitudes that the population has towards that are very different, naturally.
Yeah.
In the US, I feel like there wasn't big enough of an outcry when we found out that the government was looking at everything we were doing.
Well, it's been suppressed, right? I mean, Julian Assange is still in jail from WikiLeaks, right? And just because he outed the defense industry.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I don't understand why we preach all these freedoms in general, yet when they're actively being restricted, I mean, all these policies that we're creating about tech today, when they're, still legislation, they're still being discussed, there isn't as much of, at least I don't see it as big of an outcry towards all those policies and how they're affecting us versus China's just what happened. That sort of, let me say that sort of thing was happening in the 80s and 90s in China, or in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in China. And because there wasn't as big as an outcry, or because there couldn't have been as big as an outcry, I mean, people tried. This is where we are right now with China. And I see the same thing in America, where we're watching our freedoms be restricted, technologically speaking, and we're kind of just like, but it's the Patriot Act, what that did to kind of our perception of what the government was allowed to do to people is, how could we accept that looking back, and how are we still accepting it in the future?
Well, anytime that there's a big, massive incident that sparks fear, like what 9/11 did, then the government just increases their controls over us for right or wrong. Who knows? That's a different argument. But anyways, you just wait for these kind of one-off, fear-inducing experiences.
It's very. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, and I'm pretty apolitical in general. I just like knowing about politics and comparing them and realizing that they're a lot more similar worldwide than they are different.
Yeah.
But it is very convenient that these massive fear-inducing events keep happening at very convenient times when, technology is just emerging. New technology is just emerging, and there aren't regulations about it. Therefore, regulations need to be put in.
Yeah, we need to keep those people in check for sure, in some way, shape, or form.
And this is why this is why in conversation with people from the West, I play devil's advocate for China, advocating, if you were a government system, seeing how much social media, TikTok, the internet could influence a population like it did in Arab Spring, like it's doing with the elections in 2016 and today, what would your response be if you wanted to hold on and maintain power? I think that it's very interesting in Russia right now because it is technically a democratic country. The Soviet Union is done. I don't think people recognize that a lot because they think they still connotate Russia with communism, but not a communist country. Russia still has very, very, very strict rules on what media is allowed to be produced and replicated and just put on. And Telegram was a response against that, I guess, by the Russians. But the reason why I say it's interesting is because you see how, because media technically is free, there are a lot of anti-Putin posts in Russia going around circulating, and there's a lot of response to that from the government, imprisoning different people, on false charges or trumped up charges, essentially. So I feel like Russia's kind of in this middle ground where it can't be a complete totalitarian state with the internet like China is, yet they're still implementing all these repercussions and, prison time for those things. So it's kind of a mix of what's going on in the US, where no one's really getting put in jail for anything that they can say, versus China, where you're not even allowed to say it. So Russia's right in the middle, where you can say it, but
yeah, Russia's interesting because obviously I've been following the war for the last two plus years, and the propaganda inside Russia around what's going on in the war and how they kind of use propaganda to rally the troops within Russia and rally the population to go to war with basically a helpless Ukraine. Like it was just ridiculous. And I have a friend in Moscow, an American who's there, still there, and yeah, he's we talk. He sends me stuff that he sees all from time to time, and it's like it's China level propaganda, like like that's going on there, and it's kind of dangerous that how it's being used to like stir up support and these emotions and to justify like a war, like invading a sovereign nation that did not provoke you. And it's kind of terrifying that like that similar model could be spun up again and used in another part of the world, right?
Might be doing that exact thing.
Yeah. It's up. It's in South America too. It's crazy what's going on.
Yeah. With propaganda in specific, the reason why I think growing up in China has given me a very keen eye for propaganda, just because people need to understand, especially in the West, that for the large part, people in China understand that everything that the government produces is propaganda. People understand there's no reason to watch state media because you know what they're going to say about certain things. So that's why I think that what contributes to China, the Chinese population in general, their apoliticalness. So I remember back in, I think, 2011, 2012, there was an underground propaganda museum in Shanghai. Great museum. It only lasted a little while. I think it was a pop-up kind of thing in some basement. And it had propaganda posters from the Maoist era, continuing on until today, essentially. And it's really interesting to see how propaganda manifests itself at different times in different countries. And I feel like in the U.S., people aren't as, they're not looking for propaganda, so they don't see it, even though it's in our media every day. And I find that very interesting because in China, people understand this poster of Mao saying these things. That's what propaganda looks like. People in the U.S. think, oh, we don't have dictator posters all around, our highways. There's no propaganda here. But this country is full of propaganda.
The biggest thing I've noticed, I grew up in Canada, so I did 22 years in Canada, and then I moved to China, and then I did 18 years in China, and I'm now in LA, right? And the thing that I've noticed the most is propaganda in China is very much like, this is how you should be, this is how you should behave, this is what we expect from you, be a good city, be a good worker, be a good contributor to the community, right? Like, that's very much the gist of it. But in the United States, it's just fear. Like, the propaganda in the United States is just pumping you with fear so that you either green light whatever the government wants to do, or load yourself up on pharmaceuticals or whatever because you think that that's going to save you. And I just feel like it's a much more finely tuned propaganda.
It really is. I mean, we had the father of propaganda. We stole him from Germany after the war, so we had him doing a lot of our stuff in general. So the U.S.'s propaganda, I find it's some of the best in the world just because how subtle it is. I mean, I encourage people in general just to watch propaganda films from other countries. One, because they're wildly entertaining if you're not in that country, I should say. And two, because you'll start to notice how many propaganda films America has made in general. I mean, there's a reason why in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, letter agencies, we'll just call it like the CIA, but I don't know who it is really, had such a vested interest in Hollywood films in general, just because you can influence so much, not only within America, but also worldviews through films. Now, a great example of this is the idea of torture. Now, torture, because of movies, we all assume, oh, this is standard and it works. It's been found that, I guess you could look up the studies, torture doesn't work. Like, torturing people in order to extract information is one of the least effective ways of doing it. That's why, in large part, we don't do it. There's much more effective ways of extracting information through espionage and all these other things.
Or podcasting.
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah. It's a great point, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, people did, but because of what Hollywood's done, we always think, the tense part of the movie, someone's in a dark basement sparking up the battery, that works, this will extract information. And we've all been culturally conditioned to assume this is what happens. Torture is actually a much more effective way of instilling fear in a population in order to get them to act right. And I think Hollywood has done a great job of making people assume that all these factors, especially in foreign wars, because most people don't go to war. So our collective perception of war is really just based off people who have never been to war. So the people who really understand the concept of war from, a first-person view, they live in a very different world from the rest of us, because a lot of our propaganda in this country is based on what will happen if we don't do this, what will happen, and the necessity of committing, atrocities in the name of defense and freedom and all these good things.
Also abroad.
Abroad, yeah. We definitely happen to manufacture war for our own economic benefits. But, China's also learning from that model. NATO, pretty great at it, I'm not going to lie. Something that's very interesting is what China's doing with Africa right now is, again, similar to the playbook that we as the collective West kind of did. Now we had
the Belt and Road stuff with
Belt and Road Initiative. Great thing to look into if you want to understand world politics in general. But
there's a great book called the author, his name was like Perkins, and it's the book's called The Economic Hitman, and it's all about keeping developing countries so heavily indebted that they can't really grow or develop, but like all the banks and bankers and consultants, they're all just making shit tons of money off of these pretty poor countries, and then when they can't, they end up becoming debt slaves, and then when they can't pay their debts, they end up having to give concessions like airports or mining rights or oil rights and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole book. The guy lays it out. He worked for the World Bank. This is like all the World Bank does.
Like, it's how the world works. It's truly hilarious how easily they be able to do this under our noses. Not saying that any one person can, change this, but it's more of a general ideological change that's probably going to happen in the next. But
and all these people just hang out in Davos every January and set the agenda for the year.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Specifically with China and Africa, though, I'd like to say that the way that the West scrambled for Africa and kind of divided that up and stole all the resources and then became rich off of that and kind of made sure that Africa was indebted to them, China is taking a slightly different approach. In the long run, I don't believe that this is going to be beneficial for Africa in general, but their different approach is that they're building infrastructure in Africa. They're contributing to the economy on this kind of lend program, which the African nations that they're helping out will probably never be able to pay back. But the difference is, I feel like because the West industrialized quicker than the rest of the world is taking that playbook and just improving on it. And I think that's where a lot of the fear comes in from the Western perspective, when you're thinking about how China or India or, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, the BRICS nations essentially, are going to be operating, because it's sort of the lesser of two evils, because I would say that colonialism was definitely the greater of two evils because of how it damaged not only the country's economics, but also just changed the mindset of the people and irreparably just shifted the course of history. But the way these other countries are doing it are more of a, will help for now, but what we get out of this is going to be greater than.
So when I was in China, I worked for the New York Times, and I worked with a fantastic writer. His name is Howard W. French, and he now is a professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. And then he also writes like a book a year. The guy's a machine. But he just wrote a book called Born into Blackness, and it's all about how Europe used the slave trade in Africa to basically engineer the Industrial Revolution. And it was because of that wealth from the slave trade that basically allowed the UK, like England, to create the steam train and the cotton ginny and the printing press and all this kind of stuff. And then that obviously, had dividends and allowed the Western world to develop and advance much faster. And he lays it out, and it's spectacular.
It's shocking not only that is the case, but it's also how they've been able to change I would say how the Western world has been able to change the narrative to the West is economically and militarily superior based on their own sacrifices and their own volition and their own pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, essentially. When that's just simply not the case. If you look at if you look back in history, not even that far, this is the last, colonialism only became popular around like the 14th, 15th, 16th century. That's when its origins kind of ramped up, I guess. And it's incredible that I was just watching a documentary on what England essentially did to India and how they stole essentially $40 trillion worth of wealth by what they did essentially was not only did they colonize essentially, but they just turned the whole country into a company. They made sure that the skilled laborers, because India was essentially was the superpower in Asia for the couple hundred years. And when the British came in the 1700s, what they did is they crippled the economy by ensuring that the population of skilled laborers and manufacturers couldn't create, and they just took all the raw materials, made all the manufacturing happen in the UK, and then sold those same materials back to India at a higher price.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, colonialism is bad because of all the obvious reasons. It was colonialism is bad because it took away the soul and the power of an entire country for hundreds of years that they're only now starting to be able to recover from. And takes hundreds and hundreds of years to undo all that damage.
It's true. And I think we've always had slavery as long as there's been human beings. But I think in the 15, 16, 1700s, I think that's when we started using transportation infrastructure in a more sophisticated way to like go abroad and find slaves instead of just locally having slaves. Like, because people had slaves in the Roman days, right?
That is a very, very good distinction to have, because people always say, yes, slavery's always been around. But the type of slavery that was happening prior to colonial times is very, very different to the type of slavery that was happening after.
Like, this is probably going to get me canceled or something, but I'll say it anyways, because like in Howard's French Born into Blackness, like he talks about how like the people selling slaves in Africa were African people. There wasn't white people. Like, African people were rounding up their own people and selling them as slaves. Like, and these were some of the best, like the best, the brightest, the fittest, the strongest. Like, this was like their A-class people that instead of staying in their own country and developing their own country and making their own country wealthy and contributing, right, they were basically shipped away. And they were shipped away to enrich certain people who were of the same ethnicity, who looked the same, and the whole thing. So the whole economy behind this. Anyways, Howard just opens this right up. You love the book, I think. Yeah. Anyone that thinks they know anything about slavery, you're totally wrong. You need to read the book.
The narrative has been totally, especially in America, when we think of slavery, we think of some very isolated and specific thing. And I find that if you study the history, it's just not the case. I'd say that transportation slavery, and I think that's a very good concept to kind of roll with, because the ability for a country to essentially, I mean, with the Romans and slavery back then, they had a system of conquered nations, and it wasn't necessarily based on any one ethnic group or any one nationality. They would take these people, and there was technically a path to become a free person based on the system of the day. I'll say that because I don't want to get into too many complicated specifics I don't know enough about. However, what that the difference between that and colonial slavery is that you essentially not only take people from their economically, the lands that they were taking the people from never had the opportunity to industrialize. And because of that, they robbed them of their future, essentially. Mm-hmm. Now, you could blame the people who rounded up and caught these slaves in Africa, but slavery was happening all around the world at that point. It wasn't a specifically isolated thing. The West knew what they were doing when they propositioned people into a deal they didn't understand how the ramifications of, and essentially stole the wealth and soul of continents and continents and continents of people.
Wow, we went through propaganda and slavery there. That's a lot.
Very heavily tied together, actually. Yeah. Another thing that we could get into, I guess, on that same tangent before we move on, I guess, is the idea of the South American, how the U.S. kind of influenced South America in general to I don't want to use the word degrade, but the reason why a lot of South American countries economically aren't as good as they should and could be is because when they were going through liberal coups in the 20th century, we specifically made sure that those communist countries could never be able to prosper. So we traded communist
or just implemented the United States put their own people in power
100% of the time, and they made sure that those people in power didn't have the citizens' best interests at heart, but they nationalized their resources and sold them to the West. So we essentially traded more countries like China, which technically is a very is a regional superpower and can operate by itself, for countries that are not war torn, but they're fighting within themselves, and they're making sure that they can't rise in a unilateral way because of gang warfare and cartels and drug money that we pumped in there and had an economy in a place. So all these things tied together in just a way that it didn't need to be, but that is history.
Yeah, man, it's wild. It's nice growing up abroad, huh? You get a world perspective.
Yeah, you definitely do. You definitely do. You realize that it's just, I guess, easier to be immune to propaganda when you see propaganda all the time. I had teachers who were from all around the world. A lot of my teachers from New Zealand, a lot of my teachers from South Africa, England, all these things. So then you hear, because they're individuals who left their own country and sought a new perspective, I guess, or whatever they did it for, multitude of reasons. You learn from them in a way that whatever their country was saying about a specific issue, that's one opinion, and that's not true. Whereas when you stay in a country, I guess, forever, you kind of just, it's easier to just interpret everything as truth rather than opinion. But when you're in an international environment, you have no choice but to really consider so many conflicting opinions. Not all of it can be true. So
you're what, like 23 years old?
I'm 23.
And you did 15 years in China.
15 great years.
And what's been the biggest thing you've noticed coming back to the United States that's just kind of different or that's blown your mind after living in China for 15 years?
I think I have a whole list in my phone just of fun things that I want to turn into stories or short form content or something where I can express them. But I think there's a lot of lighthearted ones. I think I remember something that I miss in general is the truck full of pigs that I'd see on the bus on the way to school. That would just make me happy, You have a bad day, shitty morning, you wake up, truck full of pigs. Pigs. Great way to start.
I've been to one of those farms where they kill the pigs and turn them into. That was another New York Times story. That was fucked. Like seeing the way that they get killed and then sliced up and shit, and it's all with machines. It's so fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
And they squeal the whole way. The noise.
And they would. Yeah, we used to wave goodbye to them when we were on our way to school, actually. It sounds a little morbid, but the truck full of pigs. I like pork buns.
After pork buns, yeah. After having bacon on your BLT at lunch.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Growing up in China, I feel like you grow up with a sense of not helplessness, but you understand that you can't impact the social system in any meaningful way as a foreign student. So you, instead of looking for ways to change it, you accept it as it is, then kind of learn how to operate within it, which I feel like the local population also has a similar but not identical kind of.
So would you say that young people growing up in the United States actually think they can change the country? Wow, what a fairy tale that is.
Okay. I believe that young people can change the country, but I believe that the mindset that they're going to do it, this is a great topic actually, has been wrong, essentially. Now, when we look at some of the most influential leaders of change in our country, we look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, two inspirations, right? Great case studies of how change can impact a very, very strict nation that's stuck in its ways of the status quo. Now, both things that they discovered and talked about during the later parts of their career before they were assassinated is essentially the idea that injustice cannot be fought nationally and that it has to be fought internationally. That was one of the main, in my opinion, that is one of their main takeaways, that you can't fight something on a national level if you want to impact change everywhere. It's a great example of this is the protests during the apartheid in South Africa, right? The reason why they were so successful, and it took a lot of work, was that not only was South Africa protesting, but you had students in England, students in America, students in Canada, students all around the world protesting this change. It was a system that was seen as unequal in South Africa, but it was also seen as a global injustice. And when it was fought as a global injustice, change was able to be made. When, like racism is a great example. Martin Luther King said specifically that racism is not a national issue, it's an international issue, and you have to fight it on an international level. People in the UK are our greatest allies in fighting against a racist system for Americans, because the US government can't do anything to those UK students. Vice versa, if you're fighting for racial injustice in the UK, you have to rely on people internationally to help you win that fight, because they could do things that you're not allowed to, essentially. So when we protest things on a national level, we should be looking for other countries or other people in other countries who have similar ideas about something, because I know we in America love our policy of isolationism, but historically isolationism has only brought war, afterwards. Not being involved on the world stage, especially in the age of media, information, is only a detriment to ourselves. And when we isolate ourselves, we lose.
This isolationist idea isn't really real. Like, because the United States puts so much money.
It's a fantasy.
It's a total, it's
NATO would not function without us.
No, it's wild. Like this, I hear this in the news all the time, but there's nothing could be further from the truth.
No, it's a political tool to appease a population of the U.S. which has valid concerns. They want America to be first. Completely valid. You live in a country, you want your government to treat you first.
China first. Yeah, it makes
she has the same idea, Actually, that's a great comparison. She just started this whole, I remember last time I was there was a poster that was very distinctly different from the posters that used to be there. She wrote himself into the Constitution. First time it's happened since Mao Zedong, sometime in the early 2010s, I think 2013. And he put up a propaganda poster later on that said, China's dream is my dream, or my dream is China's dream. Not our dream, not like it's specifically his ideology is the will of the nation. Now, Trump, I'm not trying to just do this whole bashing of political leaders thing, but Trump has also used similar techniques in order to rally a population, where he's saying America first is my dream and it is the dream of our country, which is a great way to gather political support from a nationalistic base. The problem with that is, just like in China, it is a complete fantasy. We are more involved in other countries' affairs than we've ever have been in history. And we're probably the most significant global player today when involved in, everything. So when you say America first, what you're really saying is that socially and politically, and what we're going to say is all these things to put us first. But in reality, we're still going to continue to put the interest of others, other countries, that's going to be a high-level concern of ours. Even though it might benefit us the most, doesn't benefit the people. It benefits our government.
I always find it so funny that now living in the United States, I can bash it properly from time to time, but it's hilarious, like how much money the government spends that goes abroad for their interests, and how little money is really actually spent on things in the United States that need to be spent on. Like, it's
baffling. Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense.
And then the politicians, talk about isolationist policies to make sure that the voting population thinks like, oh yeah, they're thinking of us first, because an isolationist policy is Americans first, right? And then, but actually, all this money's going abroad,
nationally, or to our defense systems, which are pumping it internationally, and that becomes a whole global Ponzi scheme. I mean, if people want to look into it, it's just like, a kind of lame example, but still mostly right, is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points in 1918 or whatever he did. That was, he had an idea that policy should be dictated globally. Not all of his points were great, but he was denied by Congress because Congress wanted to take an isolationist post World War I, pre World War II, and a lot of because America wasn't there as a mediating factor with the League of Nations, kind of led to World War II. Not directly, but it definitely had a very heavy-handed influence in allowing countries to grow in nationalism. Because if we all do, America first, Germany first, Poland first, we're all nationalistic, then that's gonna lead to war. Versus, okay, we understand that we're involved in all these different systems. Let's just be open about that and communicate policy that could largely benefit. I mean, can never benefit everyone, but at least some people, most people.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, so let's go back a bit. When did you get interested in storytelling?
I would say filmmaking in general and storytelling. Before I wanted to do filmmaking, I wanted to be a writer. I liked writing. when I was 15, I had a friend who was into filmmaking, and I was just like, this is cool. I'll help you out with this. Started getting interested in myself. Then when I was 16, 17, 18, playing around with cameras. And then when I moved to the US, I always knew I wanted to do filmmaking on some level, whether that's narrative or just telling stories in general. But when I moved to the US, I understood that the things that I grew up with and kind of that ideology of an international community or just living in China in general wasn't able to be communicated effectively or in the way that I wanted to communicate it with my friends in America. So I decided, instead of complaining, nobody understand, just make the media that you can point to help people understand. So it was a much more, I want to communicate my ideas effectively. People like watching things. I like going different places and talking to different people and understanding their perspectives. So I see myself as a useful conduit in order to translate the ideas of an international community or just different countries in general into countries that are more culturally isolated.
That's interesting. Because I think spending time in China does spark a storytelling interest for a lot of people. Like I didn't really get into this at all until I moved to China, because I was an athlete forever and I didn't have any hobbies or nothing. And then all of a sudden I wasn't able to do that anymore. And then I just wanted to show everyone all the crazy shit I was seeing in China all the time. And then I just started writing and taking pictures, and then I started getting some work and things like that. So it was really, China really kind of motivated me to show people what I was seeing.
Yeah, I'd say I wish I had that perspective when I was there, but because I grew up in it, I couldn't see it like that. All I knew was China, Shanghai, so that was my whole perspective of the entire world. So I have almost no photos or videos of my life back then. I have a couple photos when I was a kid, and when we used to go around to Urumqi or Chengdu or Qingdao, places like that. But I really, really wish I had that experience where I was a kid, so I really wish I could have taken a camera around and just showed people, because now I'm buying books, photo books of China when I was there, reminiscing, because I don't have the content to see. And it's just now that it's changed so much in 2024, it's completely different from when it was when I was there in, let's say, 2014. It's just I wish I got to chronicle the 2014 China as much as I want to chronicle the 2024 China.
Yeah, it really has changed a lot. I remember my first trip. I basically went all the way around the country in 3 months in 2001. That was life changing.
A favorite area that you did?
It was. Obviously, I fell in love with the West, so I fell in love with Xinjiang pretty quick. I actually made a book about Xinjiang, a photography book. I visited Xinjiang 4 times a year from 2004 to 2012, and made a black and white photography book. And I've talked about the book all around the world, and it's been great. I even gave a talk about it in Hong Kong, which was a lot of fun. So that was really cool. And then Tibet. So Tibet is where I started filming, and we did the Sacred Mountains extreme treks and all around the sacred holy mountains in all the different provinces and in and around Tibet. And those 2 places kind of were the reason I think that China held me for so long. Yeah,
I can see that. I've only been to Xinjiang once. I think I was around 2006. So that was a great experience. I never got to go to Tibet, and I definitely still want to. I can see how the distinct cultural identities of those places while still being under the same flag as China. Technically,
it's always interesting. I still have people. When I talk about my filming in Tibet and stuff like that. Obviously, Tibet is a cultural region that includes parts of China, Nepal, India, Myanmar, Bhutan. It's a wide-ranging kind of cultural area. But obviously, the Tibet that we talk about mostly is a province in China, and that's a fact. But it's amazing how many people I talk to here. I was like, "Whoa, you rode your motorcycle to Everest Base Camp?" Yeah, on the Tibetan side in China. And people lose their fucking minds. And I was like, no, if you want to go there, you need a Chinese visa. That's what it means to be in that country. And it's amazing still how much of a hot button topic that is amongst people who have never been there.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely wish I understood Tibet more by going there, but I think I do have a healthy understanding of how all the gray area of that works, because it definitely has a distinct regional identity. And I think people associate regional and cultural identities with countries, and in many cases in the world, that's
No, I mean, China could easily be like 6 or 8 countries because it's so diverse.
South of China's anything up. No, the Northwest is, or the Northeast is the whole thing. The Central area is
Yeah, it's nice, like Hunan and Hubei and parts. But you know, like, but the reason why all the fresh water that goes out in everywhere in Asia starts in Tibet, right? So it's the freshwater hub of even like the Indus River, the Ganges, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River. They all start in Tibet.
all starting to, I guess, yeah, they all flow outward.
Yeah. That's why it's such an important piece of territory. It has nothing to do with the religion of the people. It's all about water.
Consequence, yeah. I see a lot of people discussing how water is going to be a lot more limited resource in the future, and I'm curious to see how the region will develop.
Well, that's when the United States will take over Canada for all the fresh water in the mountains in the north, right?
Yeah.
We're already the 51st state in some ways, culturally.
Honestly. I feel like that's a great example. I think the relationship between Canada and America is a great example to just understand maybe how European cultural identities kind of function, or just, I feel like it's sometimes hard for me, especially because I've never been to Europe, to understand certain things like that. So I understand how different nationalities but homogenous cultures would kind of coexist side by side. So I don't know if that's a revelation or anything, but it is a cool point. Right?
One thing I find quite interesting is you know, the United States is very strong. Canada a little bit less, but you know, we export lots of things and we do a lot of business with the U.S. and things like that. And I always found it very similar, like the relationship between Canada and the U.S. and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And I don't know if you know this, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, there were tons of nuclear weapons in Ukraine at the time, and they signed an agreement. I think it was in Budapest, and it's called like the Budapest Agreement, where Ukraine promised to give the nuclear weapons back to Russia, provided that Russia would defend Ukraine and never invade Ukraine and things like this. And I'm like, because the United States and Canada have a defense pact that's very similar. Like, yeah, like we basically let the United States protect us. Like they fly over the Canada, they patrol the Arctic because we don't have the resources to do it, right? So, and obviously that's just one of the deals. And I think about Ukraine and Russia, you know, having that kind of partnership and relationship, and then until something turns, right? Either one leader, you know, has a fucking brain fart one day, or else water becomes an important issue, and then all the treaties go out the window.
That's something interesting about NATO in general, is how their famous Article 5, I guess, has been, it's kind of like the biggest bluff in history, essentially. NATO in general is really just the biggest bluff in history, I think, or recent history at least, is we all collectively like the idea that there's a defensive pact between these nations, but the reality is, if something were to happen, they still have to meet and congregate and decide if this triggers Article 5. And even if it triggers Article 5, not everyone has to agree to move on the defensive pact. And if someone doesn't agree, technically then it's not instituted. The other countries can still do it. But I think the only time it's ever been triggered was after 9/11. And yeah, that's when the NATO kind of switched to their war on terror kind of focus rather than the Russian threat. And that's when peace in between, you know, Russia and NATO was at the height of it. I think Russia was even considering joining NATO back in like the early 2000s, and then everything kind of slowly fell apart all at once.
Yeah, it's a wild one. But I mean, so now that you live in the United States, like you definitely want to be a filmmaker. You want to be a storyteller. You want to kind of get into this space. And you're 23, like you're so young to have that clear vision already. I mean, can you talk a little bit about like how you see this playing out, or how you would dream of that it could play out?
Awesome. Yeah. I love talking about dreams. I'd say that, well, the first thing I'd like to acknowledge is that I definitely want to do documentary. I find that documentary is just the most fascinating thing in general. For me, because I love going to different places, meeting different kinds of people, and honestly just having conversations, telling stories, I feel like it doesn't really get better than that. Sitting on a plastic chair in the middle of Southeast Asia, having a conversation with a foreigner you never see again and sharing, $2 beers, probably the closest you can get to heaven. But I believe that
You just described Anthony Bourdain's entire career. Yes.
he
is.
Legend. I would say that because of social media in general, it's easy for people in our generation to kind of believe that they're, one, never doing enough, and two, that because it's so easy to blow up on social media, so it seems, or so it looks like, anyone can do it. You don't have to particularly be good at any one skill, or you can honestly make other people the content. And that kind of whole mentality, I feel like, makes it difficult to narrow down a dream. There's so many possibilities in order to break into like the realm of social media, so many that haven't even been created, that people think, let's just do anything in order to facilitate that lifestyle.
I just don't have a good enough bathroom selfie.
Yeah, like that will do it, or whatever. I need to interview more homeless people in order to blow up because those have millions of views, or I need to, something that will just capture the attention of the algorithm and then make that person have the lifestyle that they've always dreamed of because they've seen it through social media. That kind of whole thing, I kind of despise social media for. I think that it kind of poisons the mind of like the youth into, it provides so many opportunities. Half the jobs I'm applying to right now are all just social media coordinator, manager. So I'm not shitting on social media in general, but I do think we have to acknowledge plenty of benefits and opportunities, slowly degrading an entire, previously installed cultural system of how we operate and what people are motivated to do and what, the youth will be motivated to do in the future. In my head, I think I'm working towards what I want to do when I'm like 35. What access do I want to have to the world? I just want to be on like a small traveling documentary team, doing what just going places, interviewing people, telling the stories that, maybe not the stories that I want to tell, but the stories that I think that are interesting, or the stories that I think people want to hear. I could narrow down into a bunch of specifics, but at the end of the day, it's just taboos, or it's just action adventure, or it's just what makes this person in this side of the world cry, in order to kind of make sure that this global homogenous kind of cultural identity emerges like it's inevitably going to. But
so I had similar dreams as well, and then I started doing my shows. But it was funny, like, where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself producing, directing, behind the camera, hosting? Like, where do you see yourself as a storyteller? Because I'll tell you, like, when I first came up with my first TV show, which was riding a motorcycle around China with Tough Rides China, and I did it with my brother, like, I was having conversations where people were like, oh, that's a great idea. Like, who's going to host it? I'm like, my brother and I are going to do the fucking trip. And I'm like, no, you need to get like a professional television host. I'm like, what is that? Like, who is that person? No, like, I came up with the idea. I want to do the fucking trip. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's like honestly one that's really inspiring, just because people in general need to understand that there's not going to be some savior figure that's going to make everything, all their dreams come true. So, obviously you can look at a bunch of, alpha male TikToks.
Absolutely no one will help you. And people will, and it's funny, like, it's so funny. Everyone's risk averse. Everyone. So you talk to people in the industry, first-time filmmaker, first-time documentary filmmaker, no one wants to fund you because they have no idea what's going to come out the other side. Okay. Then you tell your whole family that you want to be in documentaries and stuff like this, and then they're like, holy shit, this kid's going to fuck up, and then he's going to come back to me for money. Mm-hmm. So don't do it. Go get a normal job. Yeah. It's so sad how people get talked out of their dreams.
Yeah, and that's always a consideration, but at the same time, I have been in the unique environment growing up, I guess, that people's opinions have never really fazed me. I think, since I was like 5 years old, people have been taking pictures of me. People have been telling me that I should act like this, everyone has those stories. I just find that growing up in China has made it painfully obvious and very overt, that kind of decision making. People are always looking at you. People always, expect you to act a certain way because they have limited information. Remember teaching English in like rural Chinese communities, and you ask these kids, just like what they think about the world, or more often than not, they'll be like, "Oh, black person, you're from Africa," and then you have to be like, and some people would take offense to that, but I'm in the middle of Baoding, in some local school, and I'm just like, why? Why is that the case? And of course, they're gonna be like, "Oh, well, I have this one textbook that we've been using for the last 45 years that tells me that," and I'm just like, well, that's so.
That's not the place to find racial sensitivity.
No, yeah, people need to that's a whole other conversation. That's a whole other conversation. But I find that other people's opinions have never been able to faze me, just because everyone in the world has had opinion about who I am and what I should do and how I should use my unique upbringing or something like that in order to monetize it. And at the end of the day, I don't want to be the story. I want to tell stories. Feel like there's a pressure for I wouldn't be averse like hosting or using, I feel like I'm a pretty interesting person, so I'm definitely not adverse to being in front of a camera, but at the same time, I just want to be involved with the being there, directing, asking people the questions. I guess the more mature response to this whole question would be, I want to be boots on the ground producing, because I am a great problem solver. I know how to make things happen, and I love things that just issues being thrown at me and me having to solve them in the moment. That's my favorite thing to do. No one wants to be sitting at home just trying to like think about what they could do. They want to be in the shit figuring it out. So whatever gets me in the shit figuring it out, whether that's behind the camera, whether that's in front of the camera, whether that's producing, whether that's directing, I'm gonna full steam ahead for that. Right now I'm doing all those roles, so I'll figure out which one is best for me. But producer director is always.
It's great. No, that's wild. Yeah, problem solving is the real deal, man. Holy shit.
I'm sure you have plenty of stories of exactly that.
The hardest ones are definitely the motorcycle trips, because so much can go wrong, and so much does go wrong, because you've got a car, one or two camera guys, maybe a local fixer, and then you've got one or two motorcycles that are constantly having issues or being crashed or being whatever. So and the trekking stuff, there were always problems, but it was a little bit more manageable because you're just kind of walking every day. So they would kind of be more Mother Nature focused, but the motorcycle trips, holy shit, those were problem solving like every minute of every day, especially India. India was a mess. Yeah. Terrifying. My brother and I were just on a call like 2 or 3 days ago. He called me on Friday, I think. And we were this week. Yeah, we were just chatting, and we just started talking about how tough India was back in the day. And he's like, "Yeah, man, it's just like India. Like, you just have to wake up and fucking just bite your lip and just fucking push through all day long." And he was like, "Yeah, we did that for 56 fucking days. It was intense."
What do you think in specific kind of made India so difficult?
The country's chaos, man. Yeah. I mean, in China, the East Coast was chaos from a traffic point of view, but once we kind of got out to Gansu, Xinjiang, like Qinghai, yeah, open roads, emptiness, right? And then Tibet was empty as well, and we went all the way to Everest Base Camp with the bikes, and then coming back into Eastern China was a mess. India was a mess every day, nonstop, never ending, like just chaos, like cows, buses, trucks going the wrong way on highways, just terrible road conditions everywhere, rain. It is, yeah. And then Brazil was really just the Amazon, like the mud in the Amazon. So that was, and it wasn't even the whole trip. It was really only maybe 2.5 or 3 weeks of Amazon. We went right through the Amazon, which was amazing and difficult. But the rest of Brazil was actually, pretty peaceful. But India hurt every day.
I'm starting to put it together. I've never been to India. It's always been a place I really want to go, but it's just, based on my experiences all over Southeast Asia, I can imagine how traffic congestion and just local politics can really dictate.
The congestion's the real thing. Like when you look at China, like 90% of the Chinese population lives on the East Coast, right? But but the thing you haven't figured out about India is India has 1.4 billion people, and you can fit like 6 Indias in China. So like if you pick up India and put it, you can put 6 of them, and there's no space. Yeah.
I would do it.
So there's cows everywhere. Like we saw our first day in India, before we even started filming, my brother and I were sitting at a traffic light in a taxi, and this guy on a scooter hit a cow. Like, I don't know how he didn't see the fucking, because there's cows everywhere, right? Because they're sacred. So they're on the highway. and we were both sitting there and we're like, is that guy gonna hit the fucking cow? Can you not see it? Like, he hit it and the bike exploded. This was a huge cow, way bigger than this table. He hit the fucking cow. His motorcycle scooter thing exploded into like 100 pieces. He went straight up into the air, landed on his back, didn't have a helmet on, and we were like, what did we sign up for? Like, we haven't even started like our ride yet, and I was like coming from the airport.
That would be that's a one way to start a trip. I'd say, Jesus, yeah, I would do it.
It was wild.
Yeah. My only bike experiences is, I guess, when I was in Indonesia, I was on a moped a lot of the time, and I mean, there's nothing like driving through a countryside. It's just beautiful the whole way. I remember just loving just riding through all the different villages there, all the different mountains. Some of my favorite times when I was there was just, I mean, there's a lot of things to appreciate from that whole experience, but on a bike specifically, riding through a misty mountain, listening to music in one ear and following a friend down the mountain, it doesn't get better than that, so.
If you want to hear a horror story, I had a very nice podcast conversation with a friend, Adam, who was here sitting where you are now. And he was telling me about how he had a scooter motorcycle accident in Thailand.
Thai tattoo? There you go.
And no, he ended up like splitting his head open. He was like in a coma. Yeah. It happens.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. A lot of people, I guess, they kind of treat Southeast Asia like an experiment to, like, if you've never ridden a motorcycle before, this is a great place to start because you can just, you don't need a license or,
Terrible place to start.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I was really grateful for China is I grew up with kind of being used to terrible traffic or what I consider normal. So whenever I go on bikes in Southeast Asia, it's the easiest thing. I understand that this is just what it is. If you can filter through the chaos, no problems. Honestly, the only people who have problems are people who impose their idea of traffic laws into whatever country you're in, and that's when you see the crashes and fatal accidents.
It is surprising because I think the first thing you learn, like when you're riding a motorcycle in a foreign country or any country, is that you have to be hyper defensive all the time, and you can never like push.
Defense is a good offense, though. If you're that person, yeah.
It's true. It's terrifying. I've had some. We definitely had a lot of close calls. Yeah. So back to your filmmaking. Like, I'm curious. So as you are now trying to enter into this space, do you see yourself forming your own production company? Do you see yourself working for another production company to kind of learn how it all works? Do you see yourself wanting to work for a studio, or do you see yourself just trying to stay as independent as possible and just making your own stuff? I'm curious where you think you want to head.
I would say
I have an opinion about all three of those options.
I would say briefly then, the people in my generation are very, very being independent is a very attractive kind of option for people because in the age of social media, people understand that they can make their own rules. They don't have limitations. They can really navigate through this complex industry, and they can do it in a way that they'll, get up and fall down a million times. But at the end of the day, once you have everything, you understand the benefit of all of that. I'd say that if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have been like, I want to learn more from like the industry side, the studio side, the production company side, just so I can learn those skills and then translate it into what I want to do. But now that I'm doing a lot more things independent and, editing everything, shooting everything, producing everything, getting the resources for everything, it's just, this industry is just something that, in my opinion, you can learn to do at any level, at any age, if you just have the drive and the willingness to learn from the best people and learn online, get the resources that you need to succeed. And what legacy production houses or studios offer is just education to that end. But at the end of the day, education can come in a variety of different ways. So whatever works for you, you do that. What works for me right now is probably going to be learning from professionals in whatever aspect that kind of comes through to. So it could be through a production house or a studio, but at the same time, I'm never going to stop creating what I want to create because I find that's the best way to learn my style. I want to learn other people's style so I can incorporate that in my style. So whatever I do with production houses or studios, that's great, especially financially. But I'm never going to stop creating.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think also too, like always be super aware of who owns what, because there's a lot of sticky-fingered people in this town that's absolutely want to be involved in anything you're doing, and so that they can, get some equity in your ideas, right? And it honestly, like, the key, I think, in so many ways to being a successful storyteller in this day and age is understanding, just understanding content ownership, and understanding like what you can do with something when you own it, and versus just making stuff and packaging it for Netflix or someone like that. Whereas, when you're developing a story, shooting it, editing it, and then putting it out into the world, like, that's your story. Like, you should own it, right? And however well or not well it does, you own that. So, and that's just part of the game. But if you're constantly just working for other people, making their stories, it can really be, especially when you have your own ideas, right? And you seem to, because that can be really soul destroying.
I can imagine that, and it is definitely a fear of mine to look back, when I'm 40 or something, and being how much of what I made did I want to make, and that kind of perspective of. Then again, being young, I'm also understand that I'm willing to do almost anything to get to a point where I can make what I want to make, and whatever that entails. Sometimes you just got to do it, but at the same time, I feel like my method of just always being independent in my, personal creations, and then also hopefully being involved with other projects and learning from them, that's hopefully going to produce the results that I want. Right now, I have a couple projects that I'm independently producing and directing, so we'll see how those go, and we'll see what I can learn from those experiences. So
there was a director a couple of years ago. He did all the I think he did all the Ocean 11 movies, like Ocean 12. Steven Soderbergh, right?
Yeah.
Did he do those?
I'm not sure. I watched them all, but I can't remember.
I think he did. Yeah, I think he directed them. But he always had like a saying, like he would always do one movie for the studios, and then he would do one for himself. So he would constantly had this like balance. So he was doing Ocean 11 with all the biggest stars in the world, and then he would go off and make like an independent film, and that was kind of how he managed his, him being able to continue to tell his version.
And I think that's a great way to do it, because, you get the money-making tactic at the end of the day, and you also fulfill that creative part of your soul that, that just never shuts up. So,
yeah,
that's something to definitely take inspiration for. I mean, from my position, I'm definitely excited to see what the future holds. Like everyone else in my generation, I'm very curious to see how all these tools that have just erupted in the last few years can be used to benefit me. But at the same time, it's a scary place to be, So... I'm excited for it, but, it's bad. We'll see.
Do you think, how far do you think you are about putting something out into the world? Like how many months out do you think you are from actually finishing a project, a short or a feature?
I've finished a couple projects before, so I definitely have some things that I'm proud of, but the things that I'm working on right now, I think that's going to be the statement that I want to make at this time that really defines where I want to be at my career currently. So I think for one of the projects, I'm maybe like 2-3 months out. For the other one, probably it's going to take a year. And I'm just kind of really anticipating the process of developing that. Luckily, I think I'm going to get to work with some of my closest friends, and also some people I haven't worked with yet. So I have some filmmaking friends who are very opinionated about the style that they do, and I'm excited to see how their ideas and my ideas can kind of mesh into these stories. So
it's good. You got to find some friends. You got to find some frequent collaborators. You got to kind of because I worked with almost the same team for like more than 10 years, and it just became so easy. And I was very lucky with finding some incredibly talented people.
That's what attracts me so much about travel documentaries, is that essentially, from what I've heard, it becomes like a family unit that you travel around the world with, have all these cool experiences. But at the end of the day, the reason why that is more attractive than just vacationing for me is I hate the idea of going to someplace for a week and enjoying myself and then taking away nothing from that experience. So many people are blessed with the opportunity to travel to all these amazing countries, and they only use one aspect of that experience. Maybe it's just staying in the hotel and by the pool the whole day, and I just find that to be everyone has their different ways of traveling, but me personally, I find that to be like a waste of the coolest experience of your life. Who knows what could be out there? Whenever I've been places, or whatever, I'm doing adventures within the country right now, it's always I always feel compelled to see what could happen, just because I know based on how many cool experiences I've had in the past, I know how quickly something sick could happen. You know, I know how quickly one decision could just make a story for the rest of your life, and I'm always looking for that opportunity. A great example was that when I was in Indonesia, there was a festival that hadn't happened in 2 years because of COVID. The Aga Aga Festival in Bali, where they make these huge statues. They light them on fire at the end of the ceremony, and then they cast all the evil spirits. Well, they bring them all to the island and then burn them. And the lore of that whole festival is very interesting. I don't want to get into it all right now, but the experience I had was, I remember I put on my flip-flops. I was just like, okay, let's just bike around the island and let's see what we can see. I remember going 45 minutes. I didn't have a plan. I didn't do a lot of research, but I knew that the less touristy, more cultural areas were more north. So I was just like, I'll take the main highway and I'll just keep on going north. If I want to go left, I'll go left. If I want to go right, I'll go right. No math. And then I remember I was about to turn around and I was like, one more mile. Let's just go. We'll see what we can see. And then about 500 meters up the road, there was a huge parade full of people. So I parked my bike. I walked around the parade, started interacting with all these people. They were handing me shots. They were, everyone, celebration, dancing was going on. Then I met one other foreign couple who was there. It was a German guy and his Indonesian wife at the time. And then they told me that there was a festival further up the road that happened in a few hours. So I jumped on the back of a bike with them, got taken to this festival, this village, an hour and a half from where I was staying, and it ended up staying there 6-7 hours. I actually got involved in the parade. You were throwing water everywhere. I was carrying these 40-foot statues, laughing, and just remember I stuffed my flip-flops in my pants because they kept on falling off, and I was just barefoot in the streets. And then I, because my phone died and I couldn't find my bike, one of the villagers, Mahendra, shout out to him, was nice enough to let me chill at his house for a little bit, fed me all these great things, like pork buns and rice and this fruit called salak, snake fruit. He actually gave me a bag of that when I left because he knew I liked it so much. So I really couldn't believe how kind people were then. But I remember that story's never gonna leave me. That's one of my favorite experiences, among a bunch of favorite experiences when I was over in Asia. And it's just like, if I didn't go that extra mile, literally, I never would have had that story. So whenever, day-to-day life, if I talk to this person at the bar, will they tell me the most insane story I've ever heard? If I don't talk to them, am I losing out on that? And that kind of lack of, or that fear of not having those experiences just motivates me to have to do what I do in the day.
Yeah, man, you got to stay curious.
Yeah. Otherwise you lose. In my head, you just lose. There's so much in life that you just are going to lose out on, I guess.
I got to the point where I was making so much television that normal life became super fucking boring.
That's a good place to be, I guess.
Yeah, maybe. I think you get detached a little bit from like everything and people, and you just kind of like live for the story. But I think also too, there's some yeah, it was a fun time. It's coming back, but it's definitely something to watch out for.
I can imagine. I think there's a lot more media that I've seen, at least in the recent years, about the ethics of documentary making. I find that a really, really fascinating topic.
Such as what? Talk to me.
There was a Black Mirror episode in season 6 where it's a great episode, actually, one of my favorite. But that's centered around this two young documentary filmmakers chasing the story and doing whatever they needed to, and that idea of sacrificing emotions or like common decency in order to pursue a story. There's a new show on Netflix called Bodkin that has podcasters do a similar thing in a similar setting. Both, I think one was Scotland, one was Ireland. So remote areas where they go to a small town who's away from like the media sphere, doesn't want these new, media fanatics to come and invade their personal lives and kind of the consequences and results of that. So I feel like that kind of idea, because of how prevalent social media is, everyone has a phone, everyone's always looking for the next moment to capture, to share on social media so they can get their 15 minutes of fame or whatever like that. I feel like unless we address that congruently as we're growing in popularity with social media usage, then it's going to contribute to a lot of really awkward situations. So it's always in the back of my mind, am I doing what were my motivations doing this for? course, as a filmmaker, you're always going to sacrifice something, maybe even a little too much in order to pursue your passions. But, there's no right answer. It's a big gray area, but I do find.
I think the job is really to educate and entertain. And I think like people are like, oh, well, documentaries shouldn't be entertaining. I mean, it's like, yeah, they absolutely have to be entertaining. But yeah, you're asking people to sit down for an hour. Yeah. And it's got to be packaged right. The pacing has to be right. And then of course, why are you going to these places? To show people, what's out there.
It's true. That question actually, I think, really stays with me whenever have a camera. Why am I doing this? To what end? Whose life am I influencing, whether my own, whether the people in front of me, or the people watching at home? It's always just, what am I doing here? And I think if you keep that question on you, not even if you're creating content or making stories or telling stories, as to say, it's if you're ever in an environment or a community that you don't specifically belong to, what am I doing here is always supposed to be a question on the forefront of your mind. Because you very well could have a great reason, but as long as you know that reason, that's a good thing. If you're kind of iffy about it, or you don't want to accept some of the hard truths that maybe you're contributing to, whether it's just minute forms of exploitation or just invading a cultural hegemony kind of concept, you should know what you're there for, and you should know what you're doing. You should know how that impacts the community. And if you can accept all those things in pursuit of whatever great goal that you're achieving, at least you're confident and at least you're comfortable.
Yeah, and just to avoid sensationalism.
Yeah, that's
not easy.
Not easy.
Well, it's exciting. I think I would love to have you kind of come back anytime to talk about your work.
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun here. It's a lot of these topics, and hopefully when I'm a little bit further in my career, I'd love to share how my mindset has kind of contributed to all that.
Is there anything else you wanted to chat about today? Anything on the go? Anything you're working on or can talk about, or just are we good?
But I feel like when I talk about projects that I haven't completed yet, the reward of me talking about it is too great, and it kind of slows the reward of me actually working on it. So keep it silent and then let people see what they got to see. So
all right. Well, when the first thing gets out, let's have a look at it and get you back on. Yeah. That'd be cool. That'd be great. I'd be honored.
Thank you.
So look, we can go here and look, this is us. Woo! And shake it out. Stay curious, man. I'm very excited to see where you head.
Yeah.